Frank Zappa passed away 24 years ago today. And the interesting thing about him is that he was part of the core music I listened to as a kid. My dad and I, as you know out there, if you've been watching my videos, did a fictive radio show on cassette tape. And he liked to play a lot of novelty-ish stuff and blend them together. And one of them was a song called The Adventures of Gregory Peccary by the FZ, Frank Zappa. So when I became a teenager, after listening to a lot of Jimi Hendrix and things like that, I began to become more curious about his music and started to get into it. Now, there are two important things to know about Frank Zappa. One is his music as it stands by itself. Frank Zappa is not only one of the most prolific artists in music history, but he's also an artist whose music went against the grain in a number of different ways. He was not somebody that quite had the euphoric optimism of the 60s. He wasn't particularly idealistic in his point of view, and was concerned and often laughed in the face of what he saw as the faux idealism of the 60s. And, you know, one can debate that all they want, but Zappa was kind of psychedelia that was counter psychedelia in a lot of ways in his attitude. There's some debate whether he was into his band members taking drugs or not, depending on who you talk to, but he kind of was really interested in music, and that's another thing to know about Zappa. Musically, he was self-taught, but he was inspired by European classical, and liked how it went into jazz and how jazz eventually evolved into rock. And he liked to explore that middle ground right all around it. His music, despite the fact that his humor, you know, often laughed in the face of authority, even more so than most people in the 60s and 70s did, you know, he had this tremendous joy and festivity to his sound. It sounded like a carnival, almost, because of the way he stretched out his influences. So his music is kind of hard to describe. I look at it as a jazz rock sound with a lot of classical references and fanfares. You'll often hear a lot of big fanfares and openings in his music, and that's just how it is. And, you know, when I was getting into Zappa originally, it was on CD, because they were much more affordable. You know, you go out into the wild now and Frank Zappa vinyl isn't cheap, you know. The 7 albums that I have here all came from 2 sources. 2 of them were from my friend Noah Natras, and the other are from the store where I actually met him for the first time, and that was Dr. Records here in Bangor, Maine. And the first album is Uncle Meat. This is a reprise reissue, so I'm not going to show you the inside of that. This album's from 1969 originally, even though this is a reissue. There's Zappa right there. This album has Ian Underwood. He would be a mainstay in Zappa's group, the Mothers of Invention. Ray Collins, Roy Estrada, Don Preston. Really great lineup there. Here's the back cover to that album. I was just listening to this, and this is a fantastic album. Another aside is that around this time, I believe it was on this tour, my father saw Zappa and the Mothers, you know, probably later in this tour, at Bangor Auditorium. And they had just bought George Duke on board with them. And, you know, he remembers seeing Frank Zappa come out in tight pink leotards, and George Duke was still playing trombone, even though he's known as a keyboardist. He also played trombone in those days. And Mark Volman and Howard Kalin, the Fluorescent Legion Eddie, were up there. And even though George Duke is not on this album, this kind of came from that same kind of era that my father saw him at. Not very fancy album art, but I've always wanted to have this album, so I was excited when I found it. And it's a wonderful album. This kind of a groupie theme. You know, there's a kind of a theatrical vignette called Do You Like My New Car, where the band members are playing groupies to Zappa. And the one thing about Zappa is that he liked his language unfiltered and uncensored. But, you know, he wasn't always cynical about it. He was very sarcastic in some ways. But he loved to have joy in his humor, and he loved to kind of laugh at things and be lighthearted about things that disgusted him. And the whole first side of this album is just fantastic, you know, jazz rock, really well done. And the great thing about Zappa, from what I've heard, is that he and, you know, the Mothers of Invention were fantastic live. You know, they even tried to get their studio albums to have a live sort of flavor. And this really captures that spirit from 1971. And sure enough, we have another live album. I think, again, from around the same time my father saw them, 71, 72. Again, George Duke is not on this, but here's the middle of that. And there's the band. I think for the most part my father saw this band. Because, you know, I think George Duke was in there around that time, because that's when 200 Motels came out, and, you know, they had a movie, so they were pretty successful. I had this album on CD, but I'd heard that Zappa had re-recorded some rhythm tracks and instrumental parts on his CDs, so I wanted to get this on vinyl to see if there was any difference, and it's still one of my favorite albums of theirs. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of the personnel. We have Roots and Ian Underwood up at the top left. George Duke, the late George Duke, R.I.P., one of my favorite artists, who I discovered Zappa in a lot of ways through. You know, aside from my dad, Jean-Luc Ponty, who I discovered through George Duke, and they're on this album together. The rest of the Mothers of Invention, and Frank. There's the back cover of that album. The next album is one that I bought from Noah, and this is Bongo Fury. It's a live album from Austin, Texas, released in 1975, between Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart. Captain Beefheart's another artist, out in the wild, a lot of his stuff. You know, if you've ever seen the movie High Fidelity, there's a bit of a joke that some record store owners don't want to sell his vinyl. It's a big collector thing, but this is a fantastic live album. Again, it's got that same, you know, upbeat, humor-filled attitude that you would hear on a lot of Zappa's live albums, with a little bit of Beefheart's, you know, eccentric approach, but it concentrates a lot on Zappa. Again, George Duke is on this album, Napoleon Murphy Brock, who was in Chester Thompson, and this also brought in Terry Bozzio, this particular era. So, you know, this was the beginning of a different kind of era for Zappa. I think this has a different label, too. I'm not sure. Yep, this has the actual discrete label. The copy of Overnight Sensation that I have does not have that discrete label, and it plays wonderfully. Wanted to thank Noah and give him a shout out for this album. And here's another one. That Noah actually gave me, and he had sold me. And this is Joe's Garage Act 1. Now, I have Joe's Garage, the entirety of it, on CD, but I wanted to get it on vinyl because this is a rock opera, and actually it could be heard in two separate parts as well as all together, and I wanted to get the two separated parts out, and here's the second part right there. But let me show you the inside, and it has a lyric sleeve. This is kind of goes into Zappa's issue with censorship a little bit later, talking about a society that's planning on banning music and doing kind of a loose concept album about that. Now, by this time, Zappa was using another imprint for his music, which would have been Zappa and Barking Pumpkin Records. So there's the Zappa label. That's another reason why some of these Zappa records might be a little bit expensive out in the wild, because they were on custom labels, some mail order only, and limited distribution. That probably accounts for why Zappa was so prolific. He had so many mediums by which to put out his musical ideas, which were overflowing. And here's the inside of this album. It's a little more pinkish. So, lyric sheet. This is probably on the Zappa label. It is. So, there you have it. Well, you may want to call it 6 albums, if you count Joe's Garage, Acts 1, 2, and 3 is an entire album, the way it's presented on the CD or whatever, but that's how it's presented on vinyl. So, you know, that's what I have for Frank Zappa. Now, his death occurred only a few weeks before his birthday, which is December 21st. And there's a couple Zappa records I want to pick up pretty soon, if I can find them. So hopefully on his birthday, I can do a tribute to him, because I like to pick an event, as you know, and kind of deal with it on that level. So that's my Frank Zappa collection so far. I don't know how much I want to go through with this, because collectively all these albums together, it cost me about $75. I didn't put it all down in one pot, but you know, those are paying $9 and $20 for an album. On certain people can be a bit of a strain, but with Frank Zappa, it's more than worth it, because his albums are just fantastic. Live ones, studio ones, whatever. They're just fantastic. So, you know, I'm remembering Frank Zappa. Enjoy your music, and peace.